The air here doesn't just feel cold, it feels old. It presses against your skin, heavy with the dust of centuries and the phantom echo of screams. Imagine a fortress of stone, a royal palace, a treasury, and most feared of all, a prison. But within this monolithic geometry of power, there was a deeper pit, a darkness engineered for oblivion. It wasn't the scaffold on Tower Hill that broke a man's spirit. It was the unseen, the silent descent into the Salt Tower, or the waterlogged terror of the Lantern Tower's depths. No, the true terror of the Tower of London was far more intimate. It was a place where hope itself was the ultimate cruelty. In a chamber so choked with shadow that the breath of the jailer felt like a whisper from the grave, men and women, once the pillars of the realm, came to understand the true meaning of powerlessness. Stripped bare not just a title, but a human dignity. We are not here to observe history. We are here to feel it, to smell the damp stone and the fear, to hear the clank of the unseen chain. We are descending now into the most feared dungeon in the history of the British Crown. Before we step fully into this haunting history, take a moment. If the forgotten whispers of the past stir something within you, consider liking this video. Subscribe to join us on this journey through time, where we resurrect a real, live event of history, breathing life back into the shadows. The barge bumped softly against the moss-slicked steps, a sound muffled by the thick, oppressive fog of the Thames. But to the prisoner huddled on the deck, it was the sound of the final judgment. This was the Traitor's Gate, a grim, arching mouth of gray stone that swallowed men and women whole, spitting them out only as corpses or broken shadows. Imagine the sheer, visceral terror of that moment. The smell of the fetid river water mixed with the cold ire of the shackles biting into your wrists, and above you, the gigantic, unforgiving bulk of the White Tower rising like a silent, implacable god. The world you knew, the gilded court, the whisper of silken gowns, the scent of lavender and wine, vanished in that instant. You were no longer lord or lady. You were simply cargo, a high-value piece of meat being transferred from the king's grace to the king's justice. The warders, tall men in the ominous scarlet and black, moved with a bureaucratic indifference that was colder than any dungeon wall, their boots scuffing the wet stone, their silence louder than any accusation. They didn't hate you. They were simply the mechanism of your obliteration. Once inside, the prisoner was stripped of every earthly comfort that defined their rank. The heavy, gold-threaded robes were exchanged for coarse, often lice-ridden sackcloth. Rings and jewels were meticulously logged and taken away. Even the leather boots were replaced by simple, cold shoes. This ritual of denudation was the first and most crucial act of psychological torture. You were being systematically unmade. Then came the cell. It was rarely the romantic, sprawling dungeon of legend, but something far worse in its mundane, inescapable reality. Picture a small, square room within the thick outer walls, perhaps 8 feet by 8 feet, where the light, if present at all, entered through a narrow slit high up, offering only a frustrating, tantalizing sliver of the sky you could no longer touch. The temperature was perpetually a chilling, damp cold, the kind that sinks into your bones and stays there, leaching your vitality. The air itself was heavy, smelling of mildew, unwashed straw, stale bodily waste, and metallic tang of fear, a smell that clung to the stone and was absorbed by the very breath you took. The true terror lay not just in the walls, but in the silence. The tower was an echo chamber of power, but for the prisoner, the sound of the outside world were entirely cut off. There was no reassuring rumble of London traffic, no distant call of a street vendor, just a maddening, monotonous drip of moisture seeping through stone, the skittering of unseen vermin, and the rhythmic, slow pace of guards outside the heavy oak door. This silence was the incubator of dread. When a door did open, the sound was shattering. The grinding of the great iron key in the lock was a spike of adrenaline, signaling either the delivery of meager food or, far worse, the arrival of the lieutenant of the tower for a conversation. Every shadow took on a malevolent shape. Every creak in the old timbers sounded like a precursor to doom. The prisoner, accustomed to the noise and bustle of aristocratic life, found their mind turning inward, becoming the final, inescapable dungeon, a profound, existential solitude where the only real company was the cold, unblinking realization of their total, absolute powerlessness before the crown. The cells of the tower offered solitude, but the true dread was reserved for the occasional, dreaded summons. When the guards came, they didn't bring mercy. They brought the cold promise of pain, ushering the prisoner away from the relative quiet of their chamber into a subterranean room that was often drier, cleaner, and chillingly purposeful. This was not a place for holding, but for breaking. The atmosphere was clinical in its cruelty, focused on extracting confessions, whether true or not, that would satisfy the king's justice. Imagine the smell of this chamber. Not damp earth, but sweat, oil, and the faint, coppery scent of old blood that seemed to be permanently etched into the flagstones. Before the prisoner stood the implements of this dark art, not hidden away, but displayed with an almost perverse pride. The executioner's axe stood ready, a brutal, simple threat, but it was the other tools, the ones designed for prolonged agony, that truly stole the breath and shattered the soul. Foremost among these breaking devices was a rack, a simple frame that was anything but. It was not designed for instant death, but for methodical stretching of the human frame beyond all natural limits. Picture the slow, agonizing sound of the ropes tightening, the agonizing friction of muscle tearing from bone, the cracking of joints, and a scream that could not be silenced. The intent wasn't just to extract words, but to utterly annihilate the prisoner's physical integrity, to make them hate their own body. In stark contrast to this elongating horror was the scavenger's daughter, a device of compression. This iron frame forced the body into a crouched ball, pressing the head to the knees, until the internal pressure caused blood vessels to burst, inducing unimaginable pain in the chest and abdomen. The prisoner was left in a sickening choice, to be pulled apart or crushed together. These were the king's instruments of persuasion, managed by an executioner who was less a butcher and more a grim technician. Understanding exactly how much flesh and spirit could be ruined before death became a mercy, transforming the body into a ruined testimony of treason. The interrogation itself was a masterful performance of psychological torment woven seamlessly with physical abuse. The interrogator, often a learned man or a cold-eyed bishop, would begin with calm, polite inquiries, treating the prisoner almost as a colleague in a difficult conversation. This veneer of civility was designed to disarm, to lure the exhausted mind into a false sense of security before the screws began to turn, literally and figuratively. They would dangle false hope, the promise of a quick pardon, the chance to see their family one last time, only to snatch it away the moment the prisoner showed resistance. The worst part was the pause. After a searing session on the rack, the prisoner would often be left manacled in a cramped, dark corner for hours, sometimes days, the pain dulling only slightly, the body throbbing, knowing the whole ordeal would inevitably restart. This deliberate waiting game was designed to allow the fear and the unbearable memory of the pain to fester, making the anticipation of the next session far more destructive than the torture itself, until the mind, seeking the only available relief, capitulated, signing a confession of crimes they may or may not have committed, simply to hasten the end. For the high-profile prisoner, the tortures of the rack were fleeting, dramatic, and aimed at swift resolution. But for others, the suffering was a slow, agonizing process orchestrated by the very passage of time. This was a tragedy of long-term confinement, a psychological war fought against the grinding monotony of the stone. Imagine years passing in that cramped, light-starred box, where the only marker of time was the delivery of meager rations, a few inches of dry bread, a bowl of thin broth, often fouled by rats or containing weevils. The lack of proper nutrition led to scurvy and debilitating illness, but the greater sickness was of the mind. Sensory deprivation began to warp reality. The prisoner would find themselves listening intently to the faintest sounds, the scraping of a guard's boot far down the passage, the cry of a distant gull, to prove the outside world still existed. When these sounds failed, the mind would invent them, filling the void with phantom whispers, the ghost of music or the imagined voice of a loved one, a cruel mirage in the overwhelming solitude. The desperate need to leave some sign of existence, a furious mark against their impending erasure, drove many prisoners to the wall. This is where the stones of the tower became the world's most tragic library. With a nail, a sharpened piece of metal, or even a bone, men like the Catholic martyr Father John Gerard and the unfortunate Earl of Arundel spent untold hours scraping out their names, crests, and sometimes profound declarations of faith or innocence. These inscriptions are not mere graffiti. They are unwritten epitaphs, acts of defiance carved into the very mechanism of their suppression. Imagine the physical strain of this task, done in the near-total dark. The fingers raw, the muscles cramped, the sound of the scratching impossibly loud in the dead silence. Each word, each date, each crucifix was a battle won against the oblivion of the crown's justice. The more suffering for Christ in this world, the more glory with Christ in the next, wrote one prisoner. His words a desperate, poetic attempt to find meaning in the absolute, dehumanizing horror of the dungeon. The insidious nature of the dungeon suffering manifested in the slow, inevitable decline into melancholy and madness. With no human warmth, no sunlight to regulate the body's rhythms, and a diet barely sufficient to sustain life, the prisoner's grasp on reality began to fray. Diseases were rampant, typhus, dysentery, and the cold consumption, but the isolation was a sickness unto itself. Men would begin to converse with the rats, or with the reflections in the small, filthy puddles that collected on the floor. Hope, that essential fuel for survival, was not swiftly crushed. It was starved, a process far crueler than a quick blow. Day after day, the realization dawned. The king had forgotten them. The court had moved on, and their very existence had been erased from the ledger of the living, only to remain a ghost locked within the unforgiving stone. This was the ultimate victory of the tower. Not the death on the scaffold, but the slow, profound annihilation of the self, leaving only a hollow shell waiting for the inevitable and often welcomed final silence. The ultimate conclusion of the tower's dark justice was the executioner's axe, but even this final act was a carefully controlled political performance, a theater of absolute power. For the common traitor, the destination was often Tower Hill, just outside the fortress walls. Here, the death was public, brutal, and designed to shock the populace into submission. Imagine the condemned being dragged through the streets on a hurdle, enduring the jeers and hate of the crowd, knowing their end would be a ghastly display of disembowelment, beheading, and drawing and quartering. The very definition of regicide's punishment. This spectacle was not merely vengeance. It was a visible lesson in the terrifying consequences of challenging the monarch, a gruesome sermon preached on a scaffold that reeked of sawdust and fresh blood. The air would be thick with the noise of the crowd, the prayers of the condemned, and the sickening thud of the axe, a noise that echoed across the city, reinforcing the omnipresent, unblinking authority of the crown. Yet, the crown often granted a final, grim courtesy to those of noble blood or high status, particularly women of the royal family like in Boleyn or Lady Jane Grey, a private execution on Tower Green, within the confines of the fortress walls. This was a mercy granted to spare them the indignity of the crowd and the spectacle of a common traitor's death, though the finality was the same. Imagine that silent walk across the green grass, often under the eye of a small, select group of witnesses, the only sound the crunch of the gravel underfoot and the rhythmic clank of the executioner's polished axe. This private death was a chilling demonstration of control, the power to decide not only when one died, but how and where that death occurred. The condemned, often dressed in their finest clothes, had to face their mortality with a chilling composure, sometimes even delivering a final, carefully worded speech to ensure the property and titles of their families were spared. The executioner, often specially imported and highly skilled, performed the act swiftly and silently, transforming a beating heart into a political statement with a single, devastating stroke, and the body was often interred quickly beneath the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula, a final, unceremonious burial within the fortress that had consumed them. When the axe fell and the gate locked once more, the story of the prisoner did not end. It merely transformed, evolving from brutal history into enduring mythology. The most feared dungeons of the tower, particularly those deep, sunless holes beneath the lantern or salt towers, became incubators for legends. Rumors circulated for centuries about secret tunnels leading to the river, hidden pits where bodies were dissolved in quicklime, and chambers so deep that the light of a candle could not reach the floor. The most potent of these legends, the spectral horror of the tower's darkness, is the enduring, tragic mystery of the princes in the tower. The young King Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York, allegedly murdered by their uncle, Richard III. Though their precise fate remains contested by historians, the belief that they were suffocated in a hidden chamber and their bodies concealed within the very structure of the fortress turned the tower from a simple prison into a monstrous, living tomb. where the silence was haunted by the voices of the innocent. The Tower of London, therefore, endures not just as a monument of stone, but as a profound philosophical commentary on the relationship between power and suffering. Its feared dungeons were laboratories of control, where the monitor was imposed upon the human spirit with methodical precision. The echoes that persist within its cold, ancient walls, the smell of damp, the phantom sound of the rack, the scratching inscription, speak volumes about the dark price of absolute rule. When we walk past the Salt Tower or stand by the silent green where queens lost their heads, we are not simply observing a relic. We are confronting our shared human history of injustice, resilience, and mortality. This fortress, designed to be the ultimate symbol of royal authority, ultimately became the greatest repository of human defiance, proving that even in the face of the executioner's axe and the soul-crushing despair of the deepest dungeon, the inherent, tragic courage of the human spirit could leave an indelible, whispering mark upon the stone, refusing to be utterly silenced by the darkness.